So hello, everyone. Welcome to a chat by the fireside. I'm Rita McGrath. You probably knew that. A couple of housekeeping things as we're getting going. This is being recorded, so please don't say anything or do anything you do not want showing up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, which is very apt because my guest today is Wall Street Journal technology columnist Christopher Mims, who has written this absolutely amazing book called Arriving Today. If you have not yet read it, you really owe it to yourself to do so. It is just so topical, so timely, and a really interesting read. I mean, who thought that, reading about ships at sea and guys in trucks and people delivering UPS packages could be so riveting, but it really is. So welcome.
Rita, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So I thought, just as we're getting to know you a bit, how did you get from a neuroscience and behavioral biology degree to studying technology and being the journal's main technology columnist?
Well, it's a long and winding road. I think my models were like Frank Herbert and Ernest Hemingway and Kurt Vonnegut and those types, because of course, all budding writers start out wanting to be novelists, and I was just aware that I needed a wealth of experience if I was going to ever write anything interesting. At the same time, I've always been interested in journalism, which is why I went toward journalism instead of, any other kind of writing. I did a bunch of things. I taught English in Japan. I spent years working in a basement windowless laboratory in Atlanta doing invertebrate neuroscience. After that, I lucked out and I built my clips and started to get internships. And I spent many years just being a freelance writer about science and technology because the topics fascinated me so much. And so many of them felt, very urgent and worth writing about, like energy and climate change, for example. And then at some point, I had enough work out there that somebody noticed me and was like, hey, do you want to come on staff? And I was like, yes. I'd like to no longer be a freelancer because that's very challenging economically.
I bet.
The Atlantic was launching their competitor to The Economist, but online only, and that's called Quartz, which subsequently was sold. I really, I spent a number of years there being an editor and a writer. And then, I lucked out that the Wall Street Journal lost their technology columnist maybe only 3 months after they brought him on, because he was immediately recruited by the New York Times, where he is still. So thank you, Farhad Manjoo, for evacuating that post and allowing me to put my hat in the ring for this job, which now I've had for more than 7 years as a technology columnist.
That's a lot of fun. Those early freelancing things, it takes a long time to become an overnight success, right?
Yes, so many years of many long days and weeks and late nights.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the popular perception, it so often happens like instantly, and yet it takes a long time to build up to that, for sure. So let's talk about the book. You obviously were working on this long before the pandemic started. What got you intrigued in the particular topics that you cover? So the book is called Arriving Today, and it traces this product all the way through its generation in a factory in Vietnam to its arrival on a doorstep in Connecticut, and just all the people and things that it touches along the way. So what got you interested in this topic?
I started because of robotics. So, I saw a video of the inside of a almost fully automated warehouse, grocery fulfillment warehouse in a suburb outside of London by a company called Ocado, which has subsequently gone on to great success. And I was just fascinated. I'd never seen such a density of robots. I'd never seen them function in that way. And, the entire time I've been a technology journalist, for a while I was at a MIT Technology Review, and the editor there, he had this really funny dictum, and this was 10 years ago. He's like, I don't want any stories about robots. And the reason he said that was, at the time, robotics was pretty limited. Like, it was still very rigid. And so people would make grandiose promises for its potential, but it was just a bunch of kind of, deaf, dumb, and blind industrial robots that could only, paint cars and weld them and couldn't do much else. But I noticed this transition happening in the field, and Ocado seemed to embody that. So, I got myself on a plane and I went and visited them, and I had a really nice chat with the person who had headed up the technology team that had built all this, the chief technology officer for Ocado. And it just struck me that there was a sea change happening in the kinds of automation that were available to us and what they were capable of. And strangely, where that change was being embodied, where it was finding its most widespread expression in commerce was not in manufacturing, it was in logistics. And, I had some hint of this from seeing how automated Amazon's fulfillment centers were as well. So that's what really got me started. And I thought I was going to write a book about technology and how it's transforming this stuff. But, luckily I have a very smart and thoughtful agent. And he's like, no, just trace the whole journey. And I'm glad that I did, because it made it a much bigger story about how technology affects our lives, how it's done it historically, and how, what are the patterns that are being repeated even today, and how that's transforming, everything we buy. And now, because of the pandemic, the cost of everything, and with even deeper and more widespread implications, like for rates of inflation.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and how's this for a coincidence? I literally was on the phone, on a Zoom yesterday with the leadership development group at Ocado, because I'm going to be doing a series of seminars for them. Small
incredible.
world. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
So the company's called Ocado, OCADO.
It's so funny that they're not better known in the US, because I think they have a $20 billion deal with Kroger, America's largest company, to build these autonomous grocery fulfillment centers in America.
Yeah, we were just talking about their global expansion strategy literally yesterday, so that was so interesting. That's fun that you got to know them.
Yeah.
So that is stunning, and I think the book left me with sort of multiple emotions. One was just awe, that this stuff works at the scale that it does. The other one was sort of concern that a lot of what you describe is very inhuman. It's really humans as badly performing robots, I guess is the way I would characterize that.
Good way to put it. Yeah.
Right. and it's hard not to be awed by these things, but at the same time, it's hard to sort of look at the people that you write about and have anything other than sympathy for them. And so maybe a good place to start is with Frederick Winslow Taylor, and you devote a couple of chapters to Taylor in the book. And I think maybe start there with the principles of scientific management, as I believe the book was called.
Yeah.
And that's now confused all the other things that you talk about.
So Frederick Winslow Taylor, I mean, maybe in your circles he's well known, but I feel like the average person doesn't know who he is. He's the most important person that the majority of people have never heard of. It's just stunning to me. I mean, to me, he is as important as a thinker as, Marx or Darwin, and yet we often just don't hear about him. And what he did was he was the original management guru, management consultant type person. And, at the beginning, at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, he had a life working in a machine shop in Philadelphia where he learned how things of the day were manufactured. And then he went on to be a consultant to, people who own these big factories. And he would go in with a stopwatch, literally, and he would track everything that a person in that factory did, a given worker, and then propose a way for them to optimize their labor. It sounds relatively benevolent, but the way that he did it was fairly arbitrary. And when the U.S. government tried to apply his techniques to the Watertown Armory in Massachusetts, the workers revolted. And then there were hearings before Congress, and his techniques, known as Taylorism, were actually banned from all federal works. So there is that history. But the crazy thing is that his techniques of optimization and what we call Taylorism and what he called scientific management, they've really become the water that we swim in. I mean, whether someone's working in an Amazon warehouse or a call center or anywhere in fast food, all of these places, all of the individual tasks have been routinized and optimized, to within an inch of their life. And it allows managers or sometimes software to really drive workers as hard as they can be driven. And we don't call it scientific management anymore, but that's truly what it is.
Mm-hmm. And so the principles are things like, break each task down into its component parts and then try to do it in the optimal way. And I first got to know about Taylor through another theorist that you mentioned, the Galbraith family. And my parents were scientists, so they were big proponents of, books that had that kind of science to them, and they ran across Cheaper by the Dozen, which was this book and then subsequently a movie, which I think for many of us was the first way we ever encountered Taylorism. But the reality of it, and it sounded so benign, like in the book they described the best way to dry yourself after a shower because you save time doing it this particular way, but that's now really bled into every single aspect of people's lives. And so one of the things that struck me as I looked at the book, and this has actually become a big deal now that we're in this pandemic stage, is the brittleness of these systems, that they have been so optimized to within, very, very tight parameters that let a little slip up happen anywhere along the lines. And it just creates system-wide calamity. And you've observed a lot of why that happens. So what are some of the primary sort of places where things can go disastrously wrong?
Yeah, I mean, the root of all this, of course, is the drive toward, just-in-time manufacturing and delivery and keeping very little inventory on hand. So it all translates into very little slack in the system. I mean, one sort of very striking example of how it's gone wrong is, I haven't checked on the latest number, but as of a few days ago, there were more than 100 giant container ships waiting in a line at the port of LA Long Beach, America's biggest port by volume, just to get a berth at one of the terminals to unload their containers. And for reference, normally there's between 0 and 3 container ships waiting. Each one of these container ships, is as big as a skyscraper, some as big as the Empire State Building laid on their side. They can carry up to 10,000 40-foot containers each. So imagine, just do the math, 5 to 10,000 containers times 100 ships. That's how many containers are waiting in a line outside the port of LA Long Beach because of the ongoing problems with congestion there. There just isn't enough capacity. There's been record demand. There's been, panic buying, not just by individuals, but by businesses, which are having to buy further and further in advance to guarantee that inventory will be on shelves or available to, ship if it's e-commerce. So, I mean, that's a great example of where there wasn't really any slack in the system. During the good times, that means it's very efficient and very low cost. It used to cost just $2,000 to ship a full shipping container port to port, China to LA. Now it's up to 10 times that, 20,000. Might have gone down a tiny bit, but I mean, imagine if you are a retailer and suddenly your ocean freight cost, which used to be not that much for you, has increased by a factor of 10. If you can even get, a berth on a ship for your container. So that is, I mean, there are many other examples, but that to me is the biggest and most striking.
Mm-hmm. And also part of why we're starting to see prices go up.
Yes, 100%.
Cost has to come from somewhere. So could you describe, because I did not know any of this till I read your book, this whole process of like the ship gets close to the port and then there's this captain, the local captain, who has to get up and basically parallel park the thing. Could you just run us through how that process works?
Yeah. I mean, as much as we have turned ocean-going shipping into a really routine business, almost like office work for the sailors on board. Once they get close to port, there is still some swashbuckling and danger and romance left in the process because these ships are so big. They're so close to the maximum size that any of these ports or terminals can accommodate that, wherever you are in the world, the captain of a ship is not allowed to take that ship into a port. They need somebody with specialized knowledge to do it. And that person is called a harbor pilot. And, the Port of LA Long Beach is sort of typical in how that works. And I've actually went out with these harbor pilots, and it's an incredible experience because they get on this, 30-foot boat that moves very quickly. It's like a speedboat, and it's just kind of chopping through the water. and it's blackout because all this is happening at 4 a.m. because that's when they want to bring in ships. And you come up alongside the ship, and they flip on a searchlight, and suddenly, it's like being underwater, I imagine, and being a diver next to a blue whale or something. Just this behemoth looms in front of you. The letters of the ship's name are 20 feet tall, and there's this terrific swell. And the harbor pilot's boat has to pull up alongside this container ship, and they throw down what is literally to this day, I kid you not, a rope ladder still. And the harbor pilot has to very gingerly, and these two boats have a different period of their going up and down, at just the right moment, kind of gingerly hop/step off of the front of the pilot boat, and there's a body man there to try to help him if something goes wrong, and leap onto the ladder and scramble up it before the swell of the ocean catches him, because if this harbor pilot goes under, their survival rate is almost zero. If you're a harbor pilot over the course of your career, you have a 1 in 20 chance of dying on the job.
Wow.
And this is how the world's most skilled pilots are transferred to the world's largest vessels over and over and over again, thousands of times a day, all across the world. This is how every single one of those 100 ships that's waiting in line outside the port of LA and Long Beach has to be brought in. Is this big, strong guy who is an extremely experienced pilot, who's so experienced that he gets paid more than $400,000 a year for his services, has to risk his life to get onto that giant ship.
And you would think they could use a helicopter or something, right?
I mean, the British Marines are testing what's literally a jetpack to get people onto boats. Maybe we'll get that someday.
Maybe. So then once he's there, right, what happens next?
Then he has to guide that huge ship into port, and they do it entirely with verbal commands. It's not like somebody puts their hand on the wheel. Even if they could, I mean, the wheel is only 10 inches across. It's comically small. The heading of the ship, you can also be controlled with a tiny knob, no bigger than the volume knob on a speaker. And they bring their own GPS systems because, of course, they don't trust the ones on the ship, because they need to guide this ship with sub-meter precision into these channels, below these bridges, where if they're a couple of meters off in either direction, they could be in a catastrophe. They could run into something. And at the same time, over radio, they're coordinating the action of 2 or 3 tugboats, which are pulling the ship and helping it steer. And in the case of the ship that I watched come in, by the time this giant container ship, gets under this bridge and has to kind of make a left turn, they just kill the engines, and this thing is drifting. It's almost like a stunt driver, throwing over the wheel on their car, and the tires are smoking, and they just kind of spin the car around, and it lands perfectly parallel parked between 2 other ships. They're doing the equivalent of that, but with a ship that's long enough to accommodate 3 soccer pitches.
It's just mind blowing, right? And then they finally get the thing to where it could be unloaded, and remember, there's 100 of them waiting now, right? You said,
yeah.
That's mind blowing, and that's where the robots start to come in, right?
Yeah. So this is where especially if you're at the port of Long Beach, which is more automated, or the Trade-Pack terminal in the port of LA, which is right next door. It's highly automated. So there's a human being still driving the giant ship-to-shore crane. These are the things that are so big that one of George Lucas's effects artists modeled those 4-legged walkers in Empire Strikes Back. If you remember those have the same dimensions as these cranes, because that's what inspired him. And so the huge cranes are very nimbly, picking up a 40-foot container, which can weigh tens of thousands of pounds, and just kind of deadlifting it and dropping it on shore. And from that moment, humans aren't involved. So that's when the robots take over. So, something called a rubber-tired gantry crane is going to roll over, and it just kind of, its legs are so tall that it can roll right over a shipping container, and then it just kind of picks it up with these cables in its belly, and then moves it over to a rail-mounted crane, which is then going to put the shipping container into these huge stacks. And that's where the container is going to be resident, hopefully for as little time as possible. But the reason those stacks exist is a port is a buffer between ships and trucks. If you had to take every container off of the world's largest container ships and get them onto trucks, it would be a line of trucks 50 miles long. Imagine the queuing problem. How would you get all of the trucks in the right order so the right containers going onto the right truck at the right moment? It just doesn't work. So ports are just giant buffers for these containers, and that's why robots help make them more efficient, more dense. These robots work 24 hours a day. So those huge rail-mounted gantry cranes, they literally do what's called grooming, where they're just sorting containers, just picking one up, moving it over like a child's block, putting it down, and just sorting it so that, because it's in its computer system and the port management system, it knows, okay, a truck's coming tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. This container needs to be the second from the top because another truck is coming for that top container. And then this way we can get the truckers in and out of the port in as little time as possible, because that turnaround time for trucks coming into the port is absolutely critical for their efficient operation.
So you talk about the international, the ILWU, and I think you call it the pact they signed with the devil in 2008, which maybe elaborate on that a little bit, because I think a lot of people don't appreciate the unintended consequences of some of these decisions and agreements that they have on human beings, that right. affect people's livelihoods.
So the ILWU is a bit unusual in that, they're not just, it's not just the International Longshoremen Workers Union. They have been, the union in control of port workers at these ports for maybe a century. And so they're like, Teamsters level old and sort of deep in their relationship with the industry that these workers work for. In 2008, the ILWU signed a new contract where they said, okay, you can do some automation in the port of LA. And that led to terminals like the Trepac terminal. And, that has meant, it does mean that there are fewer workers needed directly in the port, because you don't have the people driving the yard trucks that used to carry those containers around instead of the robot cranes. They did a recent deal where one of the terminal operators agreed to retrain a number of workers to repair those robots. And then the challenge that they're having now is in a couple of months, there's going to be a fresh round of contract negotiations. And the primary issue really is automation. How much is the union going to allow to happen, and under what terms? The last time that they had a contract negotiation like this, it got so bad that Obama had to step in, because there was such a huge slowdown at the port. I mean, workers weren't striking, but they were slowing down work there. So, I mean, if we think congestion is bad now, it might get better. And then in a couple of months, these contract negotiations could lead to even worse congestion.
Mm-hmm. So I want to segue to trucks. But before we get there, something that a lot of people don't understand is that before the invention of the container vessel, what do they call it? The boxes that go on
the shipping containers.
Yeah, before the invention of the shipping containers, which were actually invented by a guy who owned a fleet of trucks. And what he was frustrated by, and it connects to the labor unrest at the ports, what he was frustrated by was, before you had shipping containers, you literally had to load and unload ships with each item by hand in the biggest container that could be fit. But it was, it was like loading and unloading your moving truck when you move your house. There was no standardized way of doing it. And that happened in, I want to say it was commercialized in 1956, 1957, something like that, which is not that long ago. It's a few decades ago. But what that innovation did, and back to unintended consequences, it allowed you to put stuff in a box, take the box across the ocean, put the box on a truck in a fraction of the cost of the previous regime. And what that meant in turn was that the old rules, like if you picked up an old business school textbook, they would have said there's a rule about what sectors of the economy can go global, right? Anything that's really heavy, anything that needs to be transported for a far distance, anything, there were these rules, right, that we had about what made sense to globalize and what didn't. And now those rules have been completely upended. And I think that's just an interesting unintended consequences story from history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the shipping container, I mean, I really love Alan Levin's book, The Box, which is just about the shipping container, because, he really does emphasize that there hasn't been a bigger impact on global economies, on globalization, since the invention of steam or something. Like, it was just so transformative, just in the way you described.
Yeah, and very quickly. Yeah. Now let's follow our journey with our shipping box. So now it's got to go to a truck, and in some of the most sort of really scary parts of the book. Scary, I think, because a lot of us have experience of driving around on highways and seeing trucks and not giving them a second thought. But you talk about the life of a trucker, and I think you talk about Steve is his name, but just Robert. Okay, what that experience is like, and the kind of physics of truck driving, which I had not appreciated at all.
Yeah, I mean, long haul truck driving especially is the furthest thing from unskilled labor. I mean, there's a reason you have to spend months getting a commercial driver's license to drive one of these vehicles safely. It is enormously challenging. I think some of the biggest challenges on top of everything else that you have to do as a truck driver are the fact that the hours are so long. It's 12 to 14 hours a day. It can be very hard to find a place to sleep at night because America doesn't have enough rest stops or truck stops. I mean, that's why if you ever see trucks parked early in the morning or late at night, along the shoulder, and you think like, God, what happened? That person break down. No, they're just trying to find a place to sleep, and they couldn't find anywhere else. So there's not enough infrastructure to accommodate America's truckers, and it's brutal in other ways, right? I mean, most truckers are sole owner operators or work for small companies, and they are just trying to string together one load after another. Like if somebody wants you to drive from North Carolina to Florida and take a load, well, then you have to find a load from wherever you are in Florida to some other stop or back home, because if you're not carrying a load, you're losing money, right? These truckers are paid by the mile, but only when they're carrying goods. So it's a difficult way to make a living, especially for entry-level drivers working for really big shipping companies, trucking companies. They're really not making that much, and given the number of hours they're working a day, they're making less than minimum wage. And this is why that whole industry really has a burnout and retention problem. I mean, whenever you hear the phrase trucker shortage, just replace that with a high turnover crisis. Trucking has, it's difficult to know exactly how fast people churn out of it because so much of people leaving a trucking company is just jumping to another one for higher wages. But it seems to be very high. The average age of truckers keeps rising. And of course, more and more people are retiring. So that's eating up that older workforce. And that's one reason why the government just allowed the American Trucking Association to kind of write a piece of legislation saying, hey, we should now have teenagers driving these trucks. Given what we know about the teenage brain, I'm not sure that lowering the age at which somebody can drive a long haul truck from 21 to 18 is really a good idea. But it certainly fulfills the large trucking companies' goal of just having more, I mean, I hate to say it this way, but just kind of cannon fodder that they can ingest into the front end of the industry, hoping more of these people will stick around.
But yeah, I'm with you on the teenagers. That doesn't sound good. But when you talk about the skills required, right? It really is pretty heavy duty. So things I had not appreciated till reading your book were that most trucks still have a manual transmission with 12 gears, and that the experienced truckers actually prefer that. They feel it gives them more control. And then what can happen if you're cut off by a passenger car? And as you're riding around with Robert, you describe that happening like once an hour.
Yeah.
Maybe for our listeners, just sort of share with them like the consequences of that.
Yeah, I mean, truckers have to have really good situational awareness because, if they're moving 55, 60 miles an hour, it's going to take them a football field or two to come to a full stop. They can't, if they were to if somebody cuts them off and they just stomp on their brakes, odds are that truck's going to jackknife, and that is a catastrophe for everyone. That's how you end up with these multi-million-dollar, multi-car, multi-fatality crashes. The driver's very likely to be killed or injured. Because there's a huge load behind the cab of that truck, and it's connected to the truck on a hinge. I mean, physics dictates that if they stomp on their brakes, the trailer is going to try to swing around. And so, the reason trucks leave so much distance between each other generally and between themselves and the car in front is not to open up a place for people to cut them off. It's because they need that stopping distance. So yeah, it's a bit horrifying when you're in a truck, as I was during an ice storm, and I could just feel the tension, just how tightly wound the driver, Robert, I was with, the tension he was feeling. Because anytime he was on a curve and somebody cut him off and his situational awareness told him that there was going to be a slowdown up ahead, that was a potential disaster. And, he can't rapidly change lanes. He can't do anything. Like all truck drivers are the ultimate defensive drivers because they can't rely on active safety at all.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting. And of course, the systems the drivers are driving on, right, were, you talk about Hitler's highway. And yeah. I think so many of us just like, yeah, of course they're highways. Didn't Eisenhower do that? That was like a thing, right? And we have such a low level of awareness of how these things came to be. And the guy that actually invented, I forget his name now, but the guy that invented the technology for making highways had this vision of utopian villages with cars circling around them. And what he actually got was elevated highways cutting off critical parts of, cities and
yes.
Commercial.
Yeah, he ultimately regretted his essays in which he espoused highways and right. And the first modern highway, as we know it, with the the on ramps and the off ramps and all the rest, was the Autobahn, which of course, when Hitler took over, was the Reichsautobahn. And Eisenhower had two formative experiences. One was he was, as a very young man, he was with an army expedition, you should call it, that did a cross country drive. And at that time, most of America was just rutted dirt roads. It took them weeks. So Eisenhower's a young man. It takes him weeks and with these robust trucks and army vehicles to cross the United States of America. And then, he's leading troops across into Germany. And, it's really tough sledding until the moment that the Autobahn happens. And then they're like, this is incredible. We can put as many trucks and Jeeps and tanks down this well-made highway as we like. And so when he became president, those two experiences made him think like, wow, America really needs a highway system like that. This is obviously something that can facilitate transportation in the United States. And so that's why we have a highway system, the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System. People have been trying to build it for years, but Eisenhower signed off on the funding, so he gets his name on it.
Right. But again, unintended consequences. And we're now looking at the impacts of highways on things like suburban settlement patterns and what happens to downtowns when these highways go through. And I was not too long ago, I was in New Orleans, and I did not know this, but there had been a plan in the 60s to put an elevated highway right through what today would be seen as the French Quarter, the thing that all the tourists go for in downtown New Orleans. And that you can predict that would have just absolutely killed it off.
Right. I mean, famously, Gene Jacobs in the East Village. I mean, mm-hmm. Robert Moses wanted to put a highway through it. I mean, thank God they stopped him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was one of my favorite early books when I was first sort of learning about cities and how they worked. And Robert Caro's The Power Broker, about, just how this guy had this megalomaniac vision for how highways would take over the world. And ironically, he didn't drive himself. That was super interesting.
That's telling.
Isn't it? I know. But things like making bridges that were too low for buses to go through because he didn't want people of a certain socioeconomic class to enjoy his beautiful parks and roads and things that not very good.
Yeah.
So you have a documentary coming out, I understand, on the subject of the book, kind of bringing us up to date with what's going on now and where we go from here. But before we get to that, I wanted to have you share the story of this UPS driver that you were going out with.
Yeah, Jenny Rosado.
Yeah.
So Jenny, last chapter of the book, and really near the end of researching the book, I got to ride along for a day with a UPS driver, and And that is such an interesting experience because, again, just like long haul trucking, there's no such thing as unskilled labor in that kind of last mile delivery. Jenny had been with the company, I think, close to 30 years. So she was extremely experienced. She was a safety trainer. And, UPS, they really run it in some ways like a military operation. They have this thick rule book of all the things that you're supposed to do and the sequence you're supposed to do them in to do the job as efficiently and as safely as possible. Because the thing is, whenever you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, there's a danger of repetitive stress injury. I felt that just kind of walking down the steel steps of her truck over and over again on our day together delivering packages, I could just like feel it in my back and in my knees. And she's like, "Oh, you're getting off the truck wrong." She was so fast and efficient that by the time I had my seatbelt unbuckled, she was in the back of the truck grabbing a package and launching herself out the door to get it to somebody's front porch. It's the only way that these drivers can do these sometimes very heavy days where they're delivering, it's 120 stops or more in a day. They have to know their route cold, and they're assisted by this multi-$100 million Orion system that UPS built, which is really a route optimization, a giant route optimization algorithm, which tells them every day, here's the shortest route between all of your stops, and take that as you will. Sometimes they deviate from it because of their own more detailed knowledge of local conditions.
Well, one of the things I think is fascinating about UPS, which one of my colleagues describes as a cross between the army and a cult, in a good way. Right? So Jenny's been there, 30 years. People, they a lot of their executives started out as package truck drivers, right? They call them package trucks, I think. They have a very strong promote from within, very strong ethic of training, been around a long time. And you compare them to a lot of other players in these global supply chain scenarios. And they seem to me to have much more humanity in the way that they're treating their people. But if I compare them to a lot of other firms or a lot of other ways of doing things that don't operate that way. And one of the things I thought was interesting was when somebody like a Jenny makes a decision to override the algorithms, there's usually a really good and very human reason for it. So you talk in the book about unloading the trampoline first so that you can get the rest of the packages out more efficiently. And if the trampoline was like on the schedule for the end of the day, she's got to work around that thing all day long.
Yeah,
so there are really limits to what these algorithmic things can do for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and companies like Amazon, which are building their own last mile delivery infrastructure, are in very typical Amazon fashion exploring what those limits are. I mean, their approach obviously is radically different from UPS's. It's not a unionized workforce. The drivers who show up in an Amazon branded truck wearing perhaps an Amazon branded vest don't work for Amazon. Technically, they work for companies, local delivery companies that have a contract with Amazon. It's almost like a franchise model. FedEx uses the same model. One reason Amazon does that is to insulate themselves from any legal liability if that person, files a sexual harassment lawsuit or gets into an accident. Amazon's approach with those drivers is much more instead of like let's train them, it's let's observe them and optimize their behavior. Because we're watching them with cameras inside and outside the truck, and if we think they're driving unsafely, then we can tell. But that is that's a kind of Taylorism where, obviously the worker doesn't have very much agency. And that's certainly one way to optimize people's labors. There are tons of, factories and warehouses and other facilities all over the world that operate in that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Fascinating and kind of horrifying too. If I go back to trucking and back to like my teenage years in 1977, there was this great movie, right, that was made out of what was it called? The Bandit, Smokey and the
Bandit, Burt Reynolds.
And it had a kind of I won't say glamour, but there was a sort of a on the open road cowboyish feel about it, and you got the impression that for some, trucking was a great way to make a decent living and, explore the world, whatever. And here we are today where people are just, seeing the wages, seeing that, oh, maybe this would be an opportunity for me, doing the training, spending a week or 4 weeks on the job, and then going, oh no, no way can I do this over any extended period of time. And so I think that pattern of, we once had these jobs that were decent jobs, and as you say, they're not unskilled jobs, but we've had all these pressures that have caused them to become kind of low wage, less agency rich, kind of very burnout sensitive jobs. In fact, I've heard it that Amazon, which I don't know their motivations, but they were talking about becoming a great employer, maybe upon the threat of unionization. But there was somebody told me that they were actually doing calculations in the company of whether there would literally be enough workers like in America to staff their warehouses because they were churning through them so quickly.
Oh yeah, they're definitely having to make that calculus. I mean, that's one reason that their wages and their bonuses keep going up. And they're trying to find other ways to retain workers. Famously, they've always offered healthcare from day one, which helps. Now they offer full tuition reimbursement. I mean, Amazon likes to offer, higher wages, better benefits, which is fantastic. That is raising the bar in especially some of these rural communities that get Amazon fulfillment centers. It can raise wages for folks who, so-called unskilled labor. People might have skills, but the question is, can you slot yourself into a job with only a day or two's training is, I think, the fair definition of that. They do pay less than a lot of other companies that hire workers in warehouses and in logistics, which is interesting. But, Amazon's sort of trick is that they are radically expanding the pool of workers who work in logistics at all. Because at the end of the day, if we're going to replace all of those trips to the store that we used to make with e-commerce, somebody has to do that work. And even when you're using robots and trucks and all the rest to make it more efficient than making your single trip to the store, it means that the total employment in last mile delivery, warehousing, logistics has to increase. And of course, as we've seen throughout the pandemic, that population of workers is increasing at the expense of jobs where people, weren't needed at some point, like restaurants and hospitality, or just jobs where they weren't making as much money. And so they're going to give this career a go.
Really interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the documentary and, where do you see all this going? Because as I said, one of the feelings I came out of the book with was, is this even sustainable? Like environmentally, does it make sense to have these huge ships bringing stuff, like across the world? But is it sustainable from a human point of view? Have we reached some kind of tipping point?
I think that we continue to reach a series of tipping points, and that manifests in higher prices, for example, and lower availability of goods. But it's a bit idiosyncratic and industry by industry. Trucking with its burnout and retention crisis means that that's becoming more challenging and is probably contributing to empty shelves in America's grocery stores. We've hopefully by now all had personal experience with that. I found it jarring to see that the other day, but I know people in the Midwest are even worse off. In shipping, it's really unclear whether shipping companies kind of wait and see attitude. That tends to be a boom and bust industry, so they don't tend to want to buy a bunch of new ships because they're not going to go online for 3 years. Whether their reluctance to increase capacity is is going to be in line with a drop in demand for ocean-going shipping in the future, or not. And then, we are having challenges. You mentioned the environmental challenges. That just gets so complicated because so much of the environmental impact of manufacturing goods is not just in shipping it, but where it's made. So then the question becomes, where was this battery made? Where was the lithium that goes into it mined, as much as what is the journey that brought it to us? The truth is, an ocean-going vessel is from an energy perspective the most energy efficient means of transportation humanity has ever invented. And while those ships are burning extremely dirty fuel, it's called bunker fuel, the net carbon emissions from moving a container across the ocean can be lower than manufacturing something closer to home if the energy source used to manufacture it is dirtier. So those kind of calculations are really hard to sort out overall. I mean, I do think that the thing that is challenging to see as sustainable is just the total quantity of consumption, and whether, the world's growing middle class will all be able to achieve that in a way that doesn't, exceed Earth's limits for various resources and consumable ecosystem services like clean air or a livable climate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it led me to wonder, this is something Rebecca Henderson from Harvard and I have been sort of talking about a little bit about, capitalism responds to pricing mechanisms. And we potentially have mispriced so many of these elements of our supply chains in terms of not factoring in the sort of systemic impact on our environment, on our people, on our human, the human toll of it all. So since the book was published, are there new things you're sort of picking up or that you're going to bring into the documentary?
Yeah, the documentary is going to come out in March. I'm working with a team of producers on it. They're all very smart. So it's been incredible to see what they've been able to go out and gather. The thing that has really stunned me, since the book came out, I mean, I didn't anticipate there was going to be a pandemic and a supply chain crisis. I thought I was just writing an explainer about how supply chains work. But the thing that stunned me is how this problem is so persistent. And now, you have the head of the Fed, Jerome Powell, talking about like, okay, maybe we did not correctly anticipate how long these price increases are going to last. A lot of that is driven by supply shocks. It's driven by there's not enough stuff or you can't get it to where it needs to be, which is our supply chain issues, which are ultimately labor issues in a lot of ways. So it's shocking to me, frankly, and very worrisome that it feels like this is the new normal. And I think even as we return to a state where supply chains are sufficient for the demands we're placing on them, which, frankly, recessions are the fastest way to achieve that balance, unfortunately. We live in a world where extreme weather, political events, and a million other black swans can take out, a node in a global supply chain for some critical finished good or commodity at any moment, and we all just have to accept that.
Mm-hmm. It's made a lot of people much more aware of how interconnected things are. So I was working with a manufacturing company. This was after the Fukushima earthquake in Japan, and they were trying to bulletproof their supply chain, and they went down 46 layers of suppliers, and realized when Fukushima happened, they realized that they had missed some critical tiny little components somewhere, way in the backwaters of somewhere, and it took out their whole supply chain. They were just on hold till they could reestablish that source of supply. So we're very vulnerable to those things.
Yeah, and it can happen to any company, no matter how experienced they are. I mean, you would think automobile manufacturers by now know how to source their most critical components, yet they've all been hit hard by the chip shortage, which if you talk to chip manufacturers, there's a little bit of finger wagging and like, you guys have only yourself to blame because you didn't we can make chips, but you didn't lock in contracts and supplies far enough in advance. You thought you could just, get it on not the spot market, but get it on short notice. And that's not the case. And now all these companies are like, oops, we need to start, buying this capacity in advance and maybe even designing our own chips. It can happen to anybody. It doesn't matter how many decades of manufacturing and supply chain experience they have. Nike, another great example, 2 quarters in a row where they've suffered because of supply chain issues. You'd think by now they would know. Nope.
It's fascinating. Now, do you think some of these newer things, so, you've got autonomous vehicle stuff, which, to listen to some people, we're gonna have the Jetsons tomorrow, delivering stuff to us or picking us up and taking us through the air to our offices. So you got autonomous driving, you've got artificial intelligence, you've got all these sort of things that are sort of swirling around, most of which are still in that really early stage. Like you were talking about robotics when you were first in journalism being uninteresting because they were so limited in what they could do. But huge exponential improvements in performance, leading to now they're doing so much more than we ever thought. Do you see those things as just more Taylorism, or do you think there's perhaps a different way those things could change the nature of these jobs and the nature of these relationships?
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing I've learned as somebody who's done a lot of reporting now on automation and labor and the interaction between the two is that at the end of the day, these decisions are up to management. There is a certain fatalism. Sometimes people ask me, they're like, well, does our demand for next day delivery and convenience mean that this kind of exploitation of workers is inevitable? No. I mean, for every, Walmart or Amazon, there's a Costco or, a Starbucks. I mean, granted, Starbucks employees recently unionized, but that's a company that traditionally has treated their employees fairly well. And Costco is famous for treating their employees exceptionally well, and that's a management decision, which ultimately has, even rewarded their shareholders. So, whether or not bringing in automation forces more people to work at the pace of the automation in a way that, is difficult or demeaning or psychologically challenging or even injurious, as we've seen in some places, that's a management decision. For every warehouse worker I've talked to who works in an Amazon fulfillment center who's like, I'm 22 and I can do this now, but there's a reason that these warehouses have 100% turnover and you're not going to last very long if you're over 30. There are warehouse workers who work for third-party logistics providers who are like, hey, I just got this new robot that like brings things to me, or it literally follows me around and I just take it off the shelf and drop it in there, it's saving me a few miles a day walking. Like, that's pretty good. It's not bad, and so because we have a labor crunch, quality of life and whether or not people like these jobs matters more now. Workers have more leverage. Absolutely, automation can be used to make workers more productive and happier. It is up to us. And I think also, frankly, what is it? Frederick Douglass said, power never granted anything without a demand, right? I mean, the decline of, as much as, I am sympathetic to people who are like, oh, like unions in certain industries really retard, innovation or in that industry or make it really sclerotic in a way that it just gets outsourced. There is some truth to that, right? But when workers have no agency, when workers' only alternative is just to walk, and you have all these high turnover, low skilled industries where all the jobs are kind of the same, that becomes a real problem because management is never held to account. They're never forced to really be like, what's going on here and how do we improve working conditions to bring down turnover, until maybe they just can't hire workers fast enough.
Well, that's starting to happen,
it is absolutely happening.
We're seeing, I mean, certainly around here, we're seeing grocery stores not staffing their delis past like 6 p.m. Just to cite trivial examples, but, there's help wanted signs everywhere. And I think, we were dealing with the great resignation, as some people have called it. And I think workers... Yeah,
the great turnover would maybe be a better word. People are quitting. They're just demanding better working conditions and different jobs.
Our Johnny Paycheck moment has finally arrived. So for listeners who are interested in this particular topic, I can also recommend the work of Zeynep Ton of MIT, who wrote a fabulous book called The Good Job Strategy. And you may know it. What she found was if you take good jobs, which she defines as jobs where workers are able to have a path to promotion, where they're trained, where they're given the ability to do multiple things in a retail setting, for example, plus combine that with good operations. So Costco, for example, has excellent, investments in things like IT and store operations and customer experience and all that, that it's the combination of those two. So I think we would need to be careful when talking about good jobs to not just say, oh, it's not just paying people well and making sure they're happy at work. It's giving them the tools. And that's, I think, where the automation fits in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing about Taylorism that was really interesting to learn from actual labor historians and labor economists is that there is a species of Taylorism that they call benevolent Taylorism, and there are examples in automobile manufacturing, where workers had these councils and the ability to decide, okay, well, how much optimization and what kind do we want, and what's actually sustainable for us? And it wasn't that workers are just like, I want to work less, because they understood that if they weren't productive enough, that factory was going to go overseas. But giving, people some say in how their work is conducted. I mean, look, this is what white collar workers expect all the time. This is what you take for granted if you're an engineer at Google and you could walk tomorrow and go work for, Meta or Apple or whoever else. There's no reason that more of that agency can't be given to people doing all kinds of jobs, especially as automation increases, because the more automated a facility is, ironically, in some ways, in some circumstances, the more valuable the humans who are left become. Because if there's only a few dozen people running that place and one of them doesn't show up, that could be disastrous, versus the old days when there were 100 or 1,000, one doesn't show up, it's only that small decrement to productivity.
Yeah. I actually discovered this by accident in a research paper I did years ago with a colleague, Marianne Cook, who was studying human resources. So I was studying strategy and she was studying HR, and we thought, well, maybe there's a connection between the two. So she developed a metric that she called sophisticated HR systems, which had to do with the kinds of things Zainab talks about. So cross-training and development and da-da-da-da-da. And we expected the performance effect to be highest for low asset intensive jobs. So white collar jobs, basically. And what we found was the exact opposite, that the positive benefits of a sophisticated human resource system were magnified in these jobs that were asset intensive. So things like captaining a ship, for example. And this totally flummoxed us, because we said, well, surely these high impact individual service providers would benefit more from HR sophistication. And what we realized was, no, it actually is the other way around. That think of the Exxon Valdez, right? One guy screws up and we have, a global scale disaster. So that what the machines do is they amplify every single thing that the humans are capable of. And that's where the HR policies kind of come in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So as we start to move towards wrapping up, you got the documentary coming up. What else are you hoping will be sort of the next chapter of this book's life in the world?
That's a great question. I as a weekly columnist, I tend to have a very, very short time horizon where I'm like, okay, what am I writing next week? Maybe the week after. So even the documentary has been an exercise in long-term thinking I'm not accustomed to. I mean, at this point, I'm just kind of riding the lightning and continually being surprised at the book's relevance. So, I'm just at the stage now where people come to me and they're like, hey, we're thinking about this, like, what do you have to say about that? In the same way that getting into this topic in the first place, logistics was not a logical next step for a tech journalist. I'm content to kind of just let serendipity drag me along. I mean, a lot of it is, as a journalist, I'm just trying to tell other people's stories. So it's incredible. I mean, I think that without people realizing it, fulfillment, logistics, it is maybe the fastest progressing field that there is right now, because it is the real world and it applies, so many other technologies, AI, autonomy, robotics. I think it's moving faster than manufacturing is now, because manufacturing by its nature has to be very conservative in its adoption of new technologies. You could argue that certain fields in software are moving even faster, and that's true. But in terms of things that interact with the real world, there's so many startups, there's so much commercialization. I'll just give you one example. I don't think many people realize that we're really we're maybe weeks or months away from the FAA giving a number of companies approval to do autonomous, beyond line of sight drone delivery. And these companies are ready. They have perfected this technology all over the world. US FAA is very conservative, so we're kind of the last to get it. I mean, these companies are already doing drone delivery in Japan, which is not known for having a very loose regulatory structure. And we're next. There's a long. I just talked to a mayor of a small town in Arkansas outside of Bentonville. He's got a launch platform attached to his Walmart. They're already doing test flights there.
Wow.
So this kind of thing is coming, right? Autonomous trucks are coming. The first fully autonomous freight truck run was made in Arizona in the dead of night with a bunch of unmarked police cars, and they didn't really publicize it. Like, that's going to be here soon. You know, if you walk onto the campus of George Mason University or a dozen other universities all over the country, those students are already bored to death by their autonomous delivery systems, the little six-wheeled Starship robots. So much more is right around the corner, and a lot of it just depends on consumers kind of waking up that it's available to them. You know, there are other many more mundane examples, but I think the things that we buy, the way they get to us, our consumption patterns, you know, as much as it felt like same day or next day delivery from Amazon transformed that, and it has, that is just going to continue, especially over the next decade.
I love one of the phrases you use in the book, which is humans have an astonishing capacity to take things for granted, which I think is really a good note to wrap up on. So a lot more to come. Christopher Mims, tech columnist at the Wall Street Journal, author of my Vanna White moment here. Fantastic book, Arriving Today. It's a fascinating read. I mean, don't be put off by the thought that it's about logistics. It's full of, you know, great human stories and surprises and a little swashbuckling too. So thank you so much for spending the time with us. If we didn't get to your questions live, we'll follow up with you on them after things are complete. So thanks, everyone.